So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Jo, who is my colleague, and since for like 7 years or so. Jo is forensic psychologist, but soon to be also clinical psychologist. So I can see she's extremely ambitious, keeps studying. And she's also a neurofeedback counselor in charge of the office at START. She's APRA, board certified psychologist, and she completed her undergraduate training in London and postgraduate in Sydney. Jo had worked with a lot of different mental health settings, including with forensic populations in high-risk civil populations, now refugee and asylum seekers, as well as Indigenous children out of home care. And since 2015, as I mentioned, she's been providing assessment and treatment to our refugees, asylum seekers, survivors of torture and trauma. She joined our team, Neurofeedback program, since 2019, and since has worked using neurotherapy, neuromodulation in dealing with trauma, and also incorporating that with psychotherapy and culturally appropriate other psychological treatments. She's interested in positive and lasting effects that neuromodulation has in calming the brain and autonomic nervous system. So Jo, without further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just presenting a case study today about a refugee torture survivor who came to START with 50 years of complex PTSD symptoms, essentially. And what we've been doing in the Neurofeedback clinic has been combining a couple of neuromodulation approaches together, which is neurofeedback paired with the Safe and Sound protocol. Okay, so I'd just like to make acknowledgement of country, and we acknowledge the Aboriginal people as the traditional owners of this land, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. Okay, so START has been established for approximately 30 years. We're a not-for-profit service, and we started to embrace neuromodulation a couple of decades ago because it became clear that there needed to be more dynamic ways, I guess, of working with highly traumatized populations. What I really wanted to hero for today is the story of Zeya. Zeya is a 57-year-old refugee woman, and I did invite her to be here today because I really wanted her to be a part of sharing her story. I'm just really cognizant that this isn't my story to share, but it's hers. And, I think being at a conference as important as ANSA, that it's important we really hero the lived experience of our clients and really understand what it is like to walk in their shoes and how they find, how they respond to neuromodulation treatment, what it feels like for them. And, so as much as possible, when you see this slide today, this is Zeya talking to you, the audience. This is Zeya, guys, and I just wanted to really hero her experience of what it's like to do neurofeedback and SSP together as a combined neuromodulation treatment approach. And so I guess when it comes to refugee trauma, we know that the levels of psychopathology is very high and elevated. What we know that in the aftermath of post-war conflict, many individuals recover from traumatic stress, but for many, they're left with chronic psychiatric disability, which manifests. And we know that acts of torture and human perpetrated harm is widespread, and it's growing internationally at a disproportionate rate. So with refugee trauma literature, we see that there's a 1/3 prevalence for PTSD and depression, but this is really in stark contrast to a 2 to 3% prevalence of severe mental illness in the general Australian population. And so really what we can say overall is that psychopathology for refugees and asylum seekers is very severe, it's very pronounced, and it comes with its own unique set of challenges. So clearly it's beginning to emerge that not all experiences of trauma impact on mental health equally. And torture is used as a form of social control, and it's ranked as one of the most harmful life experiences that one can possibly experience. So for a lot of people that endorse being survivors of torture, it's highly associated with PTSD, depression, and somatic complaints. 1 in 5 refugees report being a victim of torture, and 5 out of every 6 refugees subjected to torture will have a lifetime mental disorder. And so when we think about the case of Zeya today, I want us to think about the length of time that she's had issues with her PTSD, and that for many torture survivors, unless they get the right treatment, that they potentially may be taking, their trauma with them to the grave. And so we'll be hearing a lot from Zeya herself, in her own words, verbatim, about what her journey has been like and what it has really been like to live with those symptoms on a daily basis. So refugees are exposed to persecution, imprisonment, physical and psychological injury, murder, poverty, deprivation, and a lack of basic human rights. And this occurs not only prior to their flight to safety, but also during displacement and even in a resettlement host country. And at Starts, we work from a biopsychosocial approach, and we understand that traumatic experiences not only impact on individuals, but also on families and refugee communities, so where the whole community has been targeted by organised violence. So studies have demonstrated EEG abnormalities in PTSD sufferers, and we know that traumatic stress is associated with lasting changes, in particular brain areas and regions. So we know that brain areas activated during a traumatic stress response will include, the amygdala, the hippocampus, periaqueductal grey, and the prefrontal cortex. So we know that the brain is constantly evaluating information from current inputs against past experiences to evaluate the environment. Am I safe? Is there risk? Is there danger? Is there safety? And past experiences create familiar reference patterns for which current experiences are compared against. And so when trauma survivors, like Zeya today, we will see changes in her neurological response, her epigenetic, hormonal, and immune response as a result of exposure to trauma. I'm just doing a quick slide here just to talk a little bit about physiological markers of trauma, and just thinking a little bit about the relationship between the brain and the heart. And we're beginning now to understand more about different mechanisms, about there being a bit of a brain-heart axis relationship, because we know that the heart also reflects functioning of the autonomic nervous system. And when we see increased systemic inflammation in the body, we see a relationship with the heart. And so when we see HRV changes, that does reflect physical and mental health, long-standing issues with physical and mental health, that when we think about our case study today, we do see not only changes in her brainwave functioning, but also a relationship between the brain and the heart. Okay, so this is Zeya. Zeya is a 57-year-old refugee woman. She was 6 when civil war broke out in her native country, and she was forced into a slave labour camp for approximately 9 years. And this is not just war conditions, but she survived a genocide. So when we think about just the level of harm that she endured and what she witnessed, it's very severe levels of systemic violence. And she left the camp when she was 15 years of age. Okay.
We lived a good life before the war. We were happy.
And so I'm just going to play a little bit of Zeya, and she will tell you a little bit about, it's not what's wrong with you, but always when we think about trauma survivors, you want to know what happened to you. Oh, sorry.
Jo, have you selected share sound?
Oh, sorry.
So up in few options, or it should be at the top of your screen. You can share sound as well.
Share sound, okay. Says you. It just has, let's do share sound. Where can I mute my audio, stop video? Sorry, Darius, I can't seem to see where share sound is.
If you move your mouse to the top of your screen, there should be a drop-down tab, and then if you can navigate to the right of that, there should be another little tab you can open, and then share sounds in there.
Share sound, okay. Let me know. I've just pressed it. Let me know if you can hear this.
We lived a good life before the war. We were happy. I was 6 years old when the war broke out. My family and I were placed in a slave labor camp. I was forced to work in long hours. I see bad things, mass graves. I remember the bodies, the blood. I see people killed in front of my eyes. Blood and guts and killing. Most of my family were killed in the genocide. I sometimes stumbled on bodies of soldiers who committed suicide. I was forced to walk through landmines. The man next to me was blown up and I saw his torso rip away from his body. I had to walk a lot. We were always on the move. If I stopped working, I would be killed instantly. I was so tired working all day, but I knew if I closed my eyes or stopped, it would be the end. I was so hungry all the time. There was a lot of disease, sickness. My children say, ew, when I tell them I ate spiders and dog, anything. I would have eaten anything to stay alive. The soldiers stole my rice to eat for themselves. They left me with nothing. They shaved my hair. Many times I was close to death. Once I was so hungry. We had nothing to eat. I ate a poisonous plant knowing it was a bad plant. It made me so sick. I was like a poison. I was vomiting, had cramps. I never feel pain like this. It was so bad. I thought I was going to die. Other times in the jungle we had no shelter. When the thunder and rain would come, I get scared. I cry. I was the youngest child in the camp. The soldiers would force me to stand on a hill by myself in the thunder, so I get struck by lightning. I felt so alone. I thought I will die and no one will come and find my body. I was insignificant. Often I was separated from my family. Sometimes I was with the other children. The days were long and I was so weak. I just couldn't stand up any longer. The other children saved my life. If I were to fall on the ground, I would have been killed. They helped to carry me. My mother and sister were killed in the camp. I heard the soldiers talk about it. When I heard this, I started to scream and cry. I was 8 years old. My father beat me to be quiet. If the soldiers knew I was crying about my mama, they would have executed me. I never saw their bodies, but I know the soldiers did what they could to save bullets. Before she went missing, my mama made me promise that I would stay alive and survive the camp. She told me my father was weak and I needed to be the one to look after him, cook him meals and be in charge. I promised her I stay alive and keep us safe. She knew she would die there, so she trained me to be a good girl and take care of everything. After she go missing, my father not the same. Sometimes I would be scared when the plane and bombs would pass over our heads. I can't go to dad. No hugs from dad. I'm not good enough. I can never forget sounds of bombs falling and the need to duck and hide.
And so just listening to a little bit about Zeya's account of, being in the camp and her extreme levels of grief and loss. there's many complex layers, and you're probably picking up on the different layers, you know, as you're listening and you've got trained clinicians' ears. And there's, you know, not just, you know, refugee trauma, but there's developmental trauma. And I think a significant event is when Zeya learnt about the deaths of her mother and sister, and she wasn't allowed to express herself or to wail or cry or to have any emotion because, you know, the soldiers would have executed her. I feel like this was at such a deep level of repression that I feel like this locked her sense of anger and trauma in her body and in her mind. And I think that this is what perpetuated, you know, this complex PTSD for 50 years. There's also issues with her attachment with her surviving parent, her father, and him being unemotionally unavailable. And, you know, there's a lot of, you know, literature on attachment and refugee families, and a lot of parents that have been exposed to a lot of war atrocities will tend to show PTSD symptoms. They will have negative emotional availability towards their children if they're, you know, deep in the throes of mental illness. And so we're seeing, you know, so many different ripples of, yeah, complex interaction between, you know, her war trauma, but attachment trauma, grief and loss, and really unprocessed, deeply held intrapsychic sort of anger and grief. I just wanted to include this slide.
My mother is...
Sorry, it's a fantastic paper by Kozlowska et al. And it, you know, talks about the different arousal responses when there is, you know, a sense of danger and how our nervous systems respond. But I did want to include this slide, as I felt that it really does show a lot, you know, some different sort of neurologically activated pathways when we think about just the arousal response, the fight or flight response, the freezing response, and a tonic immobility response to trauma. And if you just look at the different, I guess the coloured and the filled circles showcase activated neurons and activated pathways, and the unfilled circles showcases non-activated neurons. And so I thought it was just interesting just looking at the different neural pathways between these very sort of distinct stages of arousal. So prior mental health treatment, so Zeya had sought treatment her whole life. And like most refugees, when she came to Australia when she was 15, she had to learn a new language. She didn't speak a word of English. She was housed in a house with 25 other refugees. It was overcrowded. She had no money. And, you know, also her survival brain, her primitive brain is switched on. And for many refugees, when they come to Australia, when they first arrive, that's not the time that trauma processing really occurs. Really, it takes a long time to get a sense of safety from their new environment, to learn about the new socio-political system that occurs in Australia, and to find their place within the community. So what we often see is a delayed traumatic response, that it takes years to settle. And then once clients do, that's when a lot of the very severe trauma psychopathology starts to surface. And so we see this with Zeya. She sought mental health treatment her whole life. But the first time she did so, it was when she was in her 20s, and she gave birth to her children. So she had a career, got a scholarship to uni, met a husband who she loves, had children. But it wasn't until she gave birth that this almost was a trauma reset for her. And there were so many sort of hormonal changes and neurological changes. But also we find with female trauma survivors that a lot of the time when they give birth, there can be a bit of cognizance about their own lost childhood, but also fear for their children's future and harm that may bestow them that perhaps might be cyclical or intergenerational. So this, you know, the birth of Zeya's children really was when her the furor of her PTSD really sort of kicked in. And so over the last 30 years, she's been actively seeking treatment. She came to STARTS actually 20 years ago. She's seen quite a lot of psychiatrists. She's had different medications, probably been on antidepressants for 30 years. She has a lot of somatic complaints and a lot of poor health issues. So she gets acupuncture, sees physiotherapists. She's gone to anxiety clinics as well. What's interesting about her history is that she had 3 years of TMS treatment before she self-referred to STARTS for neuromodulation. And Zeya does talk about the TMS as being helpful, and it did reduce the severity of her symptoms. However, when she came to self-refer to starts, she still met criteria for complex PTSD, and she was still living a life of fear. So when I first came across Zeya's referral, and I looked at her long history of treatment, there was a part of me that thought, wow, what can I do for someone that's already sought so much treatment, and could I offer anything that's different? But as it turns out, our journey was one of discovery and you know, I'll be able to update with Zeya at the end, but there is a very, very lovely outcome for her. So let's hear from Zeya about what it's like for her to address her trauma treatment from different providers, and really what life was like for her on a daily basis.
I've been on medication and therapy for over 30 years, which helped me to control some of the severe anxiety and panic attack, which allows me to be able to go to work. However, when I drive, I feel I cannot escape. I'm trapped. I can only take the same road and hoping that there will be no extra congestion, which will further impact on my panic attack. I've had TMS treatment in the last 3 years, which has helped me to be able to drive to some of the place out of my norm without getting full-blown panic attack. But my sleep was still poor. Hard to fall asleep and wake up so many times during the night and not able to fall back to sleep again. This impact on my ability to function during the day. Brain fog seemed to hang around until 11 o'clock and unable to concentrate. I was still irritable most day and easily get snappy and angry. I tend to ruminate over the past, even not as bad as it used to be, but still ruminating. I was still hypervigilant about food, driving, and well-being.
Okay. So I've just got a quick list here of Zeya's presenting issues, but I guess what's important here is her treatment goals, and you know, these were the core issues that she wanted to address when she self-referred to starts. You know, she had a major issue for her was her anger, and we ended up giving her anger a name. We called it Gordon Ramsay. She denied the occurrence of DV, but she was dysregulated. She would yell, she would throw things, she would slam doors. She felt that she couldn't really control her anger. And quite often her anger was there as a consequence of her feeling trapped, feeling defenseless, constantly feeling hypervigilant and fearful that something bad was going to happen to her. And so, yes, she had long-standing issues with sleep. She was always fearful about her physical and her physical integrity. She would ruminate at night, and also the quality and the close friendships that she had bothered her. She wasn't an isolated person. She had good social support, but because of more of a fawn response with her father, that she always felt that she had to appease him. And this became a pattern for her, that she had to appease others in relationships. So she found she was dissatisfied in her friendships, long-standing friendships, in the relationship with her children, with work colleagues. And many of our sessions would focus on her feeling very dissatisfied and not having a voice in terms of her interpersonal relationships. Okay. Just quickly with this slide, with the ACEs questionnaire, I did the ACEs questionnaire with her, and she endorsed an ACE score of 8. So we know that when looking at refugee trauma, but a lot of developmental trauma, and home wasn't a safe place for her. I also have here the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire, which is similar to the ACE scale, but in refugee land, we kind of look at this potentially traumatic events, and it's a bit of a list of particular events that a lot of refugees and asylum seekers may face because of their journey to exile. And so Zeya did endorse a lot of traumatic events related to war trauma. And so really we're looking at early childhood adversity that is, you know, off the scale here, and we can see why her level of suffering and symptomatic presentation has been so long-lasting and so enduring. Okay, so these are the assessment measures that we looked at. On the top row, we have refugee-specific measures. So we looked at her symptoms of PTSD, depression, and anxiety. We were also curious about her physiological state, and we wanted to know about how her ANS was functioning and symptoms of arousal. We wanted to look at her EEG data, to look at her brainwave functioning, and we also were curious to see her heart rate variability data. We also collected, we also had measures of digit span, the DAS, and a wellbeing index. So this was the original treatment plan. Normally we offer 1 to 20 sessions of neurofeedback, and we have a mid-assessment, and we might follow it up with another 20 sessions. And we're always seeing, how is the client responding to treatment? What do they need more of? What do they need less of? With the SSP, because it's a priming intervention, we always use it before neurofeedback. And I've probably been doing this at the Starts Neurofeedback Clinic probably for the last 2 to 3 years. Over time, because I've been observing how clients respond to the SSP, I've been doing the CORE program, which is a 5-hour sort of treatment session. And I'll go into SSP more in the next slide. But I would start with the CORE program, do some neurofeedback, and then I'd offer them a top-up of CORE, do more neurofeedback. And then if they would like to, they were offered the chance to do more CORE at the end of their treatment, almost like a vagus nerve sandwich. There's going to be a lot of food references in this presentation, but I almost wanted to really cement this sense of ventral vagal safety, cementing this, this activation of the social engagement system, attachment repair. And, a lot of our clients do respond quite well to SSP whenever it's offered. They never say no. They're always quite open to having SSP treatment. And some people describe it as like a diet version of neurofeedback, that's just a little bit lighter, but it feels very calming, and it's not as taxing. So this was the original treatment plan, but as it turns out, we actually didn't need as much neuromodulation treatment as this. Okay, just in terms of the safe and sound protocol, some of you might be aware of what it is, but it's a device designed by Dr. Stephen Porges, and essentially it's a music program that has specially filtered music that goes through the earphones, and it titrates the middle ear muscle. And it's designed to stimulate the vagus nerve and to increase clients' reception to more soothing cues, such as higher frequency cues, such as the human voice, which is kind of tapping into the social engagement system and cues of safety. And it comes in a digital platform and an MP3 platform. So what does that look like in the treatment room? Generally, I'd sit in the session with the client, and you just want the client to be safe and regulated. So it's quite relaxing. They have their earphones on, and you can do artwork, you can do a puzzle with them. They can just sit quietly and enjoy. And as long as the client feels safe and regulated, they can just sit quietly and enjoy the music and just notice the different frequencies play. So let's see what it was like for Zeya to do SSP for the first time.
I feel that SSP helped me to regulate my mood, as to help me deal with the loss of my mother and sister, and feeling angry that I was abandoned. After SSP session, I had such a vivid dream of me, now as 50-year-old woman, helping a little me around 8 years old of being loved. I cried for the lost little girl. It has brought so much emotional anguish that I've tried to bury. And my adult version was able to deal with those emotions by looking into the past. It also helped with my anger outburst.
And so Zeya's experience of the SSP led to a lot of implicit sort of trauma reactions coming to the surface. She dreamt a lot about her time as a child in the camp and her mother. And she, through the child's eye view, when you're 7 or 8, when her mother and sister went missing, she thought her mother had abandoned her, and she was angry and had a lot of difficult emotions that she suppressed. She thought her mother had taken her sister and had gone without her. She didn't understand that they had been murdered at that time. Zeya's journey of understanding her anger and grief and loss came in layers. And the SSP as that primer before neurofeedback, it really allowed feelings of abandonment to come that had never been expressed. Zeya never said the G word. She never said grief, but it was palpable. And so we started to have deeper conversations about her experience as a child and her grief for herself, for her lost childhood. This was the treatment program. So you can see we started with SSP, and for the first approximately 20 sessions of neurofeedback, I just did some T3, T4 and T4, P4. I just really wanted to go for the temporal lobes, and I wanted to really calm those fear mechanisms in her brain. I just kept it to 12 to 15 hertz. In my heart, I wanted to downtrain, but when I would do sessions with Zeya and we would start to decrease the hertz, she would often respond with, it didn't feel as good as what we'd done previously. And whenever I tried to, gently massage treatment, the response was always, my preference is this, my preference is this. So I went with what she knew was comfortable for her. And so we did just a lot of SMR, a lot of 12 to 15 hertz. Then we did a second lot of SSP, and it wasn't as profound as the first experience, but it was very calming and regulating. And then we finished off with some C3, C4 and some FZA2. The last column there, I just want you to have a look at the treatment schedule. So ordinarily we would do neuromodulation twice a week. For Zeya, the treatment took 16 months because we're in and out of lockdown. So this was neurofeedback in the worst conditions possible, because we were in COVID lockdown wave 1 and 2, and Gladys Berejiklian was the New South Wales Premier, and we weren't allowed to leave more than 2 kilometres from home, and the office was shut for months on end. So I've put here in asterisks, as you can see, that regularly there was like a 2-month break in treatment, then there was a 4.5-month break in treatment, and then we'd convene again and there's another 4-month break. So actually we were out of neuromodulation treatment more than we were in, and that was hard. However, throughout this time I always kept weekly contact with Zeya, and we just kept up our psychotherapy. And so we would do telehealth, and we continued helping her process on her journey. So let's hear from Zeya about what neurofeedback was like for her.
Neurofeedback has allowed me to be able to fall asleep easily and have restful sleep without being hypervigilant. It helped lift the foggy brain in the morning, which allow me to be able to concentrate and remember tasks a lot easier. When I'm driving, I'm able to notice the scenery instead of scanning for potential danger all the time. I'm no longer afraid of entering the highway, such as M4, M7, without panicking that I'd get stuck and not being able to escape. My hands are no longer gripping the steering wheel so tight that it would hurt my hands. My shoulder no longer tensed up that it made my head light and a bit dizzy. When I stick in the traffic, I'm able to sit without the full-blown panic attack. I'm no longer thinking ahead about catastrophe that might happen before any new journey like I used to do. I'm no longer thinking of strategies to combat all the events that I think may happen. I'm no longer checking and rechecking my food that might make me and my family sick, even though there is no reason for it to be so.
Okay, and so I did ask Zeya what was the difference between SSP and neurofeedback, because they're different types of neuromodulation methods, and I was curious about what that was like for her.
SSP seemed to work on my emotions such as anger. Neurofeedback provided the sleep quality and calming effects, as well as lifting the fog from my brain. The combination of continuing counseling during the lockdown, especially with trauma-focused therapy, which I've never had before, had enabled me to deal with that last remnants of trauma, which has lingered on all this time.
So even though initially I viewed all these multiple lockdowns as problematic, in hindsight, it just allowed us to do deeper psychotherapy work. But I was curious, what that felt like for for Zeya. And, you know, she was appreciative of being able to continue that therapeutic work and having that diet together throughout this journey. So this is just the psychotherapy schedule. I'm not going to go into it. You could have a quick look. But I think what was important in terms of her sort of internalizing and suppressing and having this deep intrapsychic fear for her life and deep anger, it really was embedded in a couple of very traumatic events, which she's described. And really the last bit of neuromodulation work was with less technology and more about the you know, counselor and client diet and that therapeutic bond, and being able to help her process particular events, which really actually helped to unlock her defense cascade. And you can see, we're going to go through some very brief data slides, but you'll actually see the change in arousal symptoms as well as we progress through treatment. Okay. I just thought I'll let Zeya tell you a little bit about what it was like to do in vivo exposure, which helped also to really challenge some of those safety behaviours and avoidant behaviours that really maintained her PTSD.
Since the combination treatment of SSP and neurofeedback are already working in reducing my anxiety level, the vivo exposure was the final stage of challenge to change my behavior and to prove it to myself that I can do it. During the process for each of my fear, I was able to cope without getting the full-blown panic attack. I was able to help my son through the time of our beloved pet dog died. I was able not just look at him, but also touch him, which I wouldn't be able to do before. It made me realize that death can be peaceful. I used to think death was all about suffer and pain, but when Muffin died, I learned I don't have to be afraid of the body. It taught me death can be peaceful. I never seen like this before. Since then, I was able to go to funeral without fear. I have been able to be alone, especially sleeping at night time, without having to call on my dad to come to stay with me. I can eat food, especially chicken, without fear of getting food poisoning. I'm no longer ringing up friends and relatives for reassurance about chicken meat. I can now trust my own judgment.
And so I just wanted Zeya just to tell you about her final healing journey, which was symbolically recognizing it being the 50th anniversary of her mother's and sister's death. And Zeya didn't realize this, but she told me about a dream she had of her mother, and we explored that in therapy. And then it dawned on her, and she said, it's 50 years next year. And so I knew from that moment that I had to hold her until this event came. And so we actually did the bulk of our neurofeedback treatment in the first year, and the last 6 months was waiting for this event to come, doing some preparation work and some healing work and debriefing afterwards. But I'll just let Zeya tell you a little bit about that.
When my mother and sister was killed during the wartime, we were told that they was an enemy of the new government, as my mom's father was a military man for the previous government. We weren't allowed to cry for them. To do so would mean that we'd all be killed as well. They've told us that they've stabbed them to death and left their body in the jungle. We never had any sort of funeral or farewell for them. Part of me was hoping that they somehow escaped and would come to find me one day. Another part of me was angry that my mom has left me one day and disappeared forever. There were no closure for us truly acknowledging that they were truly dead until after SSP treatment, where I dreamed of me seeing a little 8-year-old girl with no love and was abandoned. I cried so much for this poor little girl that I woke up with tears streaming down my face. I cry for me. I cry for my mama, my sister. Counseling helped me think maybe it was time to have this closure. Our family had decided to have the Buddhist ceremony where the monks acknowledging the passing of my mother and sister. By hearing these words spoken from our monks of the passing, I was able to accept allowed myself to finally mourn their death.
And I think that the healing journey for Zeya, she wasn't alone in this final journey. She actually had the support of her family, of extended community, and she addressed the rupture with her father. Her father was very much involved in this symbolic grief ceremony. And so the event of there being a death anniversary, it was less about the murder of her mother and sister, and it was a celebration of their life. And it was a celebration of survival for the family. And there was a lot of healing involved. There was a lot of cooking, and there was a lot of, conferring with Buddhist monks, and there was stories shared from more than 50 years ago about stories about her mother, stories about her sister. And Zeya brought a photo in of her mother, which had been restored. And it was so beautiful, and you could just see the family resemblance. And so after the burial ceremony, this seemed to shift the last residual sort of autonomic and brainwave dysfunction that was lingering for Zeya. And everything fell down like a pack of dominoes. Everything became pretty much extinct. And I think what's symbolic about this, that, with polyvagal theory, ventral vagal safety, that she repaired and reconnected her attachments with her community, with friendships, with her children, and ultimately with her father. And it was a sense of collective healing, which I think was very powerful. So the end of treatment, what does it look like? A lot of holding for Zeya. I knew that within the neurofeedback, within the first 4 sessions, her symptoms dropped by 75%. She showed an instantaneous, very good response to neurofeedback. And, it was very quick for her symptoms to decrease. But there was always residual ones, and depending on psychosocial stress, they flared up. Once she was able to process this deep loss, she was then ready to discharge. But of course, clients are never sure when they've lived that long with psychiatric disability. They can't believe the N word, which is normal. They're afraid to say it. They think it's going to come back, and they don't want to discharge. And so every fortnight I'd be like, Zeya, what would it be? When do you feel like you might be ready, or what's it like for you? And she'd say, 1 more session, Jo, 1 more session. But 2 months after the grief for the life celebration ceremony, really for her and her family, she was ready to say that treatment's finished. And I gave her the autonomy to make that choice for herself. Okay, so this is the pre and post data. I'll just go through super quickly. So yeah, the pre data, we're looking at, yes, she would have, symptomatically met criteria for PTSD, depression, anxiety, but the post scores, for someone that was very worried about getting sick all the time and dying, she actually had COVID that week. She was in isolation. And you'd think sometimes, when clients get unwell, they get the flu and their trauma gets retriggered because they had that loss of control on their body. This didn't happen for Zeya. She was completely in control. Even though she had COVID, she said, I'm fine. I'm getting better each day, each hour. This is okay. And so that fear reaction was not heightened. And it's a perfect other little bit of in vivo exposure that you can't predict. But she got COVID and she handled it beautifully, and it didn't re-trigger any sort of traumatic stress for her. And with arousal, this is probably one of the most significant things, because when she referred to starts and we were looking at symptoms of arousal, on a daily basis, she had 50 symptoms of dysregulated arousal. Half and half, there was about 20 symptoms of over-arousal, 20 symptoms of under-arousal, and she had instability symptoms too. But that's a lot of nervous system dysregulation and pinging very quickly between those states. By the time we had the 20 sessions of neuromodulation, her arousal had decreased and it was more regulated. And then the post was only 6 sessions of neurofeedback, but a lot of psychotherapy. And that really led to the extinction of that autonomic dysregulation that was so disabling for her. With HRV data, so actually her baseline heart rate was quite good for someone that had so many years of chronic stress. She was a healthy woman in that she exercised, she did Tai Chi, she had a good diet. And so her heart rate was surprisingly quite good at a baseline level. After treatment, you can see the difference in the heart rate, that it has slowed a fair bit, even though this is just a one-time mark measurement. But I do think when I look at the data, I think of her, the vagal influence that's been embedded in her treatment. And I see this more of a sign as being a strong parasympathetic influence in terms of the relationship between her nervous system and her heart. We also looked at the DAS. Yes, there were very severe symptoms with depression, anxiety, and stress. And again, it correlates what we saw with our arousal questionnaire, that when the end of treatment came, there was nothing that troubled her for someone that really lived with such a long level of psychiatric disability. So that's wonderful to see. We saw increases in well-being. And the digit span data, she actually had very good attention and working memory with her baseline data is way above average. In her job, she does work with a lot of data, and she's a manager, so she's cognitively switched on. But yes, she always felt that brain fog. She felt it was hard to make decisions, and there was a minor improvement at the end, but the qualitative feedback was she was always saying that how much better her head felt and how much clearer she was in terms of her mental acuity. Okay. So here we have the EEG data, and I'm aware of the time, so I won't go too long into this. But basically, what did we see? So we did see, the baseline finding was that there was desynchronized EEG with mu and left frontal temporal transients, and that does suggest there's issues with inhibitory control, difficulties with inhibitory control. As she went throughout treatment, we did see a decrease in mu, and we saw improvement in the temporal lobes. And we also saw some compensatory mechanisms, beta-1, in the temporal lobes, stabilizing that area and making transients less severe. And overall, we can say that there's been improvement in slow content, and at central and left frontal locations. And so we have seen improvements in sleep substage activity. We have seen improvements in thalamic functioning and improved coordination and processing in the cortex, and just a really stable level of arousal. Okay. So in a nutshell, overall, we do see that there are changes in brainwave patterns. We do see changes in the temporal lobes. We do see improved autonomic function and a decrease in heart rate over time. We saw changes in complex avoidance and hypervigilant behaviours, and the slowing of brainwaves overall. We saw a significant reduction in terms of her complex PTSD, depression, and anxiety symptoms, achieved to the point of extinction. She felt the best she'd ever felt at the end of treatment, and these findings were robust across self-report questionnaires as well as physiological marker measures. And I'm aware of time. I'll start with this question, because this one's for you guys. What would you like to say to members of the ANSA conference about how you can help best patients from refugee and non-refugee backgrounds with a similar background to Zeya? And I will let you hear from Zeya.
I hope that more sufferers are able to access these programs to get earlier help rather than living with their fears and suffering in silence, which impacted on their families and their quality of life. I still know many people from my background who is currently suffering but had no knowledge of this type of treatment that can help them, or how to get access, as a lot of their GPs don't have knowledge of the service in order to refer them on. I've only heard of the service incidentally from a friend who is currently working in this area after hearing about my struggle and my various treatments with private services. These were very costly and not many could be able to afford.
And so the update on Zeya is that the reason she couldn't be with you today is because she's in a worldwide trip in Europe. She's been spontaneous. She used to be afraid of going away on holidays because she would never know what the closest hospital was. And so her life was always dominated by safety behaviors. But now she goes glamping in Uluru where there's no hospitals. She's overseas living her best life. Her Gordon Ramsay has become a Jamie Oliver. and she loves making leftovers. Second day food tastes great because of the flavors, and she makes soup out of the meat. And she likes using the quiet toilet at work. She used to be afraid of using the faraway bathroom at work or at home because if something were to happen, no one would find her. And she says now, I like the quiet bathroom. So she's doing very well. And the final comments from Zeya, just a quick one.
I'm thankful to START's team for providing the support and treatment to fight my last battle with my demon and reclaim my life back. I'm not a victim of my circumstances, but I'm a survivor.
Okay, so I just wanted to say thank you. I'm going to open the space for a few quick questions. I know I'm aware of time, but thank you so much for all your patience, for bearing with me with the technology issues. Thank you most of all to Zeya as well for giving us the chance to hear her voice and to have her experience celebrated today.
Thank you, Jo. That was absolutely wonderful. What was very special, apart from everything, was actually hearing the words of the real person. And I think it just, to me, brought back together what Sieben was talking earlier. You were that devoted Ada in that therapy with her, and it was just wonderful. So I'll just ask people if they want to ask a question or comment, because this was beautiful presentation and outline of the work of START's and Neurofeedback Clinic. Or are we all speechless? Terry, do you want to ask?
I'll say something. Jo, that was wonderful. You did really, really well in spite of all of those troubles at the start. An excellent presentation to pull apart. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Terry. Your words are so sweet. Thank you so much.
And Jo, you brought heart back to what we do. And I think just having the opportunity to hear from a client is so touching and rewarding for us as clinicians to hear such a success story, and that she is living her life now. But she wouldn't be there just with neurofeedback or SSP program or combination of all techniques that are there. What you really pointed out, and also your client, Zeya, that actually you are the key ingredient in all of this. Without your care, without you being attuned to her and her needs, and when she was in treatment and what she wanted to do, so respectful of her making decisions about her treatment. That is what made the difference. So you really, thank you so much. You made us proud.
Thanks for your patience, guys. I'm so sorry about the technology issues, but thank you. And I think I'm singing everyone's songs because I know I just look around the room, the virtual room, and I can feel everyone's heart. And this is why I think we all do this work together, because it's all about heroing the client and doing what we can to make that difference. So I think this is a collective pat on the back for all of us that work in this industry. But, thank you for such amazing colleagues as well.
Gillian, you have your hand.
Thanks, Shayla. Thanks, Jo. That was awesome. Just a bit of a technical question. Sorry if you covered it and I missed it, but how much of the SSP was for this case and more generally face-to-face and in-person? And are you guys doing any remote delivery of SSP as an intervention?
All done face-to-face. And this was with the physical program, which is the MP3 player.
Okay.
I do believe that we are going to be moving into the digital platform.
Yeah.
But I do.
So it was 5 by 1 hour, not the 10 by half hour?
Yeah, so actually the first SSP, Zeya could tolerate, she did core in just over a week. Actually, she could tolerate the full hour, and that was fine. The second time she did it, it was a bit slower, and there was a few days where we had to do a little half-hour session, or she said, I've had enough, and that was okay. So that probably took maybe 2.5 weeks to do the second round of SSP, and that was just led by her saying, I'm good for today, or that's enough for me, and that was okay.
Thank you. And would that be with different therapists on different days, or was it always with yourself each time she did the SSP?
Always with myself. I would always sit in the room with her, but as I could watch her body in the room and see how she'd respond to the frequencies, there were times where I knew I didn't have, that she was okay and she could keep busy with activities. And so yes, I was there probably 85% of the time, and then towards the end you could see how she was it was very calm and regulating. She was okay.
Cool, thank you.
Any other questions, guys? Comments? Anything? I think we're all really touched by this, Joe. I'm definitely humbled by this, and again, reminded of why we're doing all of this, as you said. But, thank you for saying it's all of us, but it's actually you who has done all this really hard, beautiful work. So you need to, just want you to be proud of yourself, and just to say how honored I am to actually be your colleague. Thank you